Hello, hello, Flavio again. We're here reading the book Frank Baler Finds T.H. So happy to be here. And we are going to continue reading where we left off last time. For those of you following on the print version of the book, which is available on Amazon, we are on page 31. If you're just joining us now, I suggest you go back to the first video in the series where I began reading from the very cover, from the very first page, and I read everything explaining what I believe Frank Baler meant when he wrote this book. I have spoken to Frank Baler about this on several occasions, and I have also read the book a number of times. So I believe some of the comments that I have been making here could be useful to some of you to understand the hidden meaning behind the words that Frank Baler wrote. So without further ado, let's continue reading. And I'm reading off of the Kindle, which may even be available for free at Amazon. If not, it's not very expensive. But I suggest you pick up a copy of the book, whether it's the Kindle or the print, so that you can follow along as I read. I asked Frank Baler, would he be willing to sign a few copies? And he says he would be willing. Drop me an email, I'll arrange it for you, have Frank Baler sign it, send it to you. If it's in the United States, I guess, send it by mail, and you can have a physical copy of the book signed by Frank Baler himself. But anyway, it's great that you're here, and we're happy to make all of that available for you. Let me continue reading the book. Remember, he was told by John and Priscilla to read 5 biblical accounts and come back when he has something novel to say. So he says, so he leaves the office, John and Priscilla's office, and he says that he gets to his car, he's crying, he's in a deep crisis. And in the last video, I explained a little bit of what I understood to be the sort of crisis that Frank Baler was facing. And so that's the previous video. So if you haven't seen that, I suggest you see that before we go on, because it's going to make more sense to you. So let's go now let's continue reading, right? So he says, for various reasons at the time, I had lost the ability to read. For a good 2 months, I could not extract meaning from written words. Now, this mysterious man, who seemed to know details of my personal life, was asking me to read 5 biblical accounts in one day. I knew I could not do it, but there was something else I could do. I went back to the office, washed my face, pulled out blank sheets of paper from the printer tray, and began to write. I wrote about the biblical characters, allowing only memory and intuition to guide me. This is one thing, this is me, Flavio, now. This is one thing that I love about what Frank Baler taught me in this one passage, because what I've noticed is that in every single paragraph, and I don't mean to interrupt the reading too much, I want to get to the book, because the book is what's important here. But to me personally, what I have noticed is that in every single paragraph, there's a huge life lesson. I find it fascinating. That's why I'm so in love with this book. That's why I'm doing all of this. That's why, and check this out. He's with John and Priscilla. They tell him, go read 5 biblical accounts. Come back when you have something novel to say. Frank Baler was in a crisis of a magnitude that he lost the ability to read. He couldn't sleep. He told me details about this crisis. We're going to continue talking about what actually happened to him. But the point is that because of the crisis, he was not able to read at the time. Now, Frank Baler is a scholar, multiple college degrees, whatever, but so it's not that he doesn't like to read. He lost his mind was a little bit confused because of the crisis that he was facing. So at the time, he couldn't read. So rather than going home and crying some more because he couldn't read, he says, I knew I couldn't read, but there was something else I could do. And the lesson that I got from that, and I wonder if you find it to be equally interesting. And if so, put in the comments below, there's something else I can do. Because look, all of us come up to a point in our lives where we feel that there's nothing we can do. As you all know, I'm a hypnotherapist myself, and just last night I was working with a man, as an example, who told me that he's facing this particular problem and there's nothing he can do. And he proceeds to list all the reasons why there's nothing that he can do. And my mentality, which I got from Frank Baler, is there's always something else that we can do. Everything that you're telling me may be true. You know your life, I don't. If you tell me that's true, that's true. But there's always something else that you can do. And I find that to be fascinating. You see, Frank Baler was told as part of an exercise to go home and read something. He knew he couldn't read at that time, but there was something else he could do. My invitation to you is this. If you're feeling stuck right now in your life, in whatever area, your relationships, your income, your money, your job, whatever the situation is, if you're feeling stuck, you're probably thinking there's nothing you can do. And your mind is going around in circles or in loops, as we call it, telling you there's nothing I can do, there's nothing I can do. What I'd like for you to do, and I learned this from Frank Baler, I repeat, accept whatever reasons your mind is telling you that you cannot do whatever you need to do or whatever it is that you want to do because of these reasons. True. Now ask yourself, is there something else I can do? Is there something else I can do? I worked with a man once who wanted, his whole thing was he was frustrated because he wanted to own a horse. He wanted a horse. It's a true story, by the way. He came to see me because he was deeply frustrated because he wanted a horse and he didn't have one. We talked about this quite a bit, and I kept asking, but what is it about the horses? Oh, I just love horses. Horses are my life. Without a horse, I'm nobody. He just wanted horses because he identified his whole sense of being with horses. He liked horses. Again, I repeat, it's a true story. But he couldn't own a horse. He didn't have the space for a horse. He didn't have the money for a horse. He was frustrated because he couldn't be around horses. So I said, well, what else can you do? What else can you do? Again, all of this from Frank Baler. There's nothing he could do. He couldn't buy a farm. He couldn't buy the horses. There's nothing he could do. So I asked him if he knew anybody who did have space and horses. He says, of course, I know several people who have ranches that have horses. I said, do you think that any one of those people might need somebody to help around the horses? He says, yeah, I'm sure that, horses require a lot of work. I didn't even know any of this. Horses require a lot of care. So to make a long story short, he decided to go knock on some of these doors and offer his help for free. In exchange for helping for a few hours a week to care for these horses, he could hang out with the horses and ride the horses, and which he found an owner, a ranch owner, who had 4 or 5 horses, needed help with the horses, was happy to have him come over. He was able to play with the horses, and after 2 or 3 days, this owner saw what he was doing, says, no, you cannot come here for free. I'll pay you. So in other words, he already had a job and a career. He wasn't doing this for the money, but the guy says, I'll pay you. He says, I don't want to pay. I just want to play with the horses. He says, play with the horses all you want, but you're doing such a great job. And the reason why he was doing a great job is because he actually loved the horses, just as he said. So the owner said, I'll actually make you an employee, so you actually get paid, and you can play with the horses all day if you want. So the point is, he came in with this huge frustration because he couldn't have the horses, but there was something else that he could do. He could go help somebody else who had horses, who couldn't care for the horses, and in so doing, he developed a relationship with these other horses. They were technically not his property, but he still had a relationship with the horses that satisfied him immensely. This is how we solve the problem. We solve the problem by realizing that there's something else we can do. If you're stuck right now, after your mind is done telling you all the reasons why you're stuck, say, okay, that's true, but what else can I do? And you're always going to find a way out. Frank Baler is told to read. He can't read, but he says, there's something else I can do. So, went back to the office. I wrote about the biblical characters, allowing only memory and intuition to guide me. I wrote for a few hours, sheet after sheet, one side only. Night time visited us. I stood up to turn the lights on and continued writing. I wrote stuff I never knew, but I never paused to read it. The battle within me was unbearable. It hurt more than I thought I could stand, but at the same time, I understood what was happening. One part of me wished so much to die as a way out of the extreme pain. The other part of me felt that life would actually start once I got through this process. Somehow I felt, not quite knowing what it meant, I must go through what Joseph, Moses, Samson, David, and Daniel went through. I would find what I had been looking for centuries on the other side of this ordeal. And this battle that's taking place within Frank Baler is so human, isn't it? Haven't you ever been in a situation like this? A part of him wanted to die. Now, he wasn't suicidal. I've asked him many times, were you suicidal? Were you thinking of killing yourself? No, he wasn't suicidal. But the pain was so unbearable that he actually wanted to die. And but he knew that there's no, and he's going to explain more about that later, there's no point in dying because the pain continues on the other side. But he also knew that all he needed to do was get through this challenge, and on the other side, there was a glorious future for him and for us as well. So this is what he's talking about here, and that created a battle within himself. I was awake all night. As usual at that time in my life, I was awake all night, as usual at that time in my life. He couldn't sleep. He told me this many times. At about 3 in the morning, I usually went for a walk at a local park, sometimes a jog. I dozed off for a few minutes at a time, but immediately jumped up startled in a panic. I was happy to go back and talk to John and Priscilla that afternoon. This is a very interesting thing, because we talk about PTSD and we talk about all of these things, and we talk about panic attacks as something that people experience every now and then. Frank Baler told me that he was having a panic attack that lasted months, one continuous panic attack. Well, later he actually goes to the doctor. His heart wasn't, it was an extreme case of, was extreme, right? But he recovered entirely, he told me. Nothing, no sequel, no problem. So it's fascinating. And I think, and he explains to you how he recovered. This is the point of reading this book. So then he says, I looked over all of my scribbles. I looked over all the scribbles I had written the day and night before. I decided to summarize it all in a way that would make sense to John in case he asked me for a report on the homework assigned. You can see the academic in Frank coming out there. What I wrote was a poor summary of the biblical accounts. I later found these notes. One of the things that I talked to Frank Baler about, and you can see this in the book, he took a lot of notes on what was happening. He took a lot of notes, journals, before this crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis as well. It's really interesting because he would have a record of what was going on, and oftentimes he would say, wait, am I imagining this or did this really happen? He would go back to his journal and confirm or deny what his mind was telling him. Was fascinating. So these are the notes that he found in his journals that he later put in the book. He says, Joseph, book of Genesis, sold into slavery by his brothers, ended up in Egypt, eventually the headmaster at Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife attempts to seduce him. He is loyal to his boss and refuses her. She feels disgruntled and accuses him of misconduct. He is sent to jail where he heals many, primarily through dream interpretation. Hypnotherapy, in parentheses. Eventually, Pharaoh has a dream no magician can interpret. Joseph is called from jail, and Pharaoh ups the ante by asking Joseph to tell him his dream and then interpret it. This is a fascinating chapter in the Bible. Pharaoh had a dream, was disturbed, so he asked all his magicians, astrologers, magicians, to interpret the dream for him. Nobody could, so somebody says, oh, there is one guy in jail. He's in jail now, but he does know how to interpret dreams. They call him over, and of course, Pharaoh is, I suppose, the Bible doesn't say that, but I suppose Pharaoh is skeptical. This guy just came from jail. Who is he? What does he know? My magicians could not interpret my dream. This guy from jail probably doesn't know anything. So he decides to up the ante. He decides to make it more difficult for Joseph. And he says, all right, don't just interpret my dream, because I'm going to tell you what my dream was. You tell me what my dream was, and then you interpret. And Joseph says, dude, nobody can do that. I cannot tell you what your dream was, but God can. So give me a day to think it over, and I'll come back. And Joseph does come back with the dream and its interpretation. So let's just read here. Joseph says only God can do that, so he comes back the next day with the dream and its interpretation. Pharaoh makes Joseph second in command of Egypt. Later, Joseph saves Israel because he's in charge of the food supply. So there was a famine in Israel, and they send people, actually Joseph's brothers, to Egypt to buy food. And that's how they rekindled the relationship there. But they wouldn't have been able to buy food had Joseph not been the one in charge of the food supply. So it's fascinating how God works in mysterious ways. So Moses, book of Exodus, found in a river by an Egyptian princess, raised as an Egyptian, but of Hebrew origin, kills an Egyptian and flees to the desert. God asks him a favor. He offers God several excuses why not him. God teaches him magic. He outperforms the Pharaoh's magicians and eventually splits the Red Sea to free his people. He climbs a mountain where God gives him the 10 Commandments. But when he comes back, many built a golden god. Moses never makes it to the promised land after 40 years wandering in the desert. So this is a summary that Frank Baler wrote because he was told by John and Priscilla to read about his characters. Samson, book of Judges, a Nazarite. So the Nazarites were, nowadays, if you go to Israel, they say that a Nazarite is somebody born in Nazareth, same town Jesus was born, presumably. But if you look at the ancient texts, the Nazarites existed before the town called Nazareth existed. This is fascinating. I've been there. And the Nazarites were part of a Jewish sect called the Essenes. They're also known as the Nazarites. So the Bible actually says, way before Jesus, that Samson was a Nazarite. And we know from historical records that that term was used prior to the appearance of this town called Nazareth. So a Nazarite is somebody with a different orientation within the Jewish philosophy, and those are the mystics, the Essenes, the mystics. So Samson, book of Judges, a Nazarite, son of a barren mother. Where else have you heard of a barren mother? Well, you have seen Sarah, Abraham's wife, right, that couldn't have children. She was barren. She ended up having children, a child. But also Mary, the mother of Jesus, she was a virgin, or she hadn't known Joseph, her husband. So it isn't that she was incapable of conceiving the way the Bible presents it, but by not having been with a man, she was presumably not capable of having a child, and yet she did. So there's something, a little hint there, there's something that ties up Abraham, Samson, Jesus, all of these figures that we see in the Bible, there's a line that runs through them because their stories contain similar elements. All right, so Archangel Gabriel intervened in her pregnancy. Same with Sarah and Mary. Strong man has several affairs. Eventually is seduced by Delilah, who betrays him. His eyes are gouged out. I think his tongue was cut out. He was tied to a millstone, going around in circles, lost. His hair grows back. He regains his strength and destroys the Philistine palace, killing the Philistines who enslaved him and himself. David, 1 Samuel, young boy volunteers to defeat a giant warrior. He throws a stone, killing the giant. Really represents the ability to overcome major obstacles. Daniel, Book of Daniel, refuses to bow down to the king, only bows down to God. The king punishes him by feeding him to the hungry lions. In the morning, the lions are laying down next to Daniel. The hungry lions represent the bestiality of human ignorance. The Spirit of God prevails over ignorance always. The next day at 4 o'clock, I walked in to see John and Priscilla and handed him the sheet of paper. John, as usual, surprised me. He never looked at the paper. He simply tossed it in the garbage bin next to him. That means nothing, he said sternly. Well, I can't quite read right now, and you asked me to read. Yes, I asked you to read, but I did not ask you to read a book. I was hoping you would have read your soul and come up with something better than that crap. In fact, I asked you to come back when you had something novel to say. That is not novel. That is memorized crap, he said as he stood up. Oh, Margarita, your manager, told me to come back, I said defensively. Frank, have you heard of the Kabbalah? The lovely wife asked, rescuing me from John's apparent fury. Well, yes, I said. What have you heard about Kabbalah, dear? This woman was wise, I thought. Adding the word dear at the end of the question melted a lot of tension away. I mentally thanked her for that gesture. Well, I have been studying Kabbalah since the early 90s. In the mid-90s, I received 3 initiations into Kabbalah in America, Israel, and Egypt. When I turned 40 years of age, according to tradition, I started teaching Kabbalah. Have been teaching and studying it ever since. My answer did not seem to impress anybody. In fact, they each seemed to look at me as an imposter. Perhaps it was my own inner misery and self-judgment speaking, but inside, in my mind, it felt as though they were saying, if you are a Kabbalist, how come you're so devastated? The craziest part of the story is that I felt like answering aloud. It is because of Kabbalah that I'm suffering so much. Okay, John said, now sitting down and much calmer. All right, so this is really, really interesting. We'll wrap it up this video and continue next time. John and Priscilla, or John tells him to go read 5 biblical accounts and come back when he has something novel to say. When he leaves the office, the manager tells him, come back tomorrow at 4. Well, inside they told him, okay, come back when you have something novel to say. Priscilla told him, call us in the morning. He wasn't sure, right? But the manager says, tomorrow at 4. So he figured, okay, I cannot read right now. Let me just write whatever I remember. At least I do my homework, right? At least I know what he's talking about. So he goes to the office. He lived at the office at the time. He writes all these notes, whatever, and he cleans it up a little bit, summarizes what he wrote, because he wrote many, many pages. He summarizes in a simple 1-page, 2-sided thing, and hands it to John, feeling proud of himself. I'm a good student. I did the homework. John doesn't look at it. he tosses it in the garbage bin and says, that's memorized crap, And I did not ask you to read a book. I asked you to read your soul. So they get into this thing, well, she told me to come back. I wasn't supposed to come back. They get into that. And Priscilla cuts right in and says, wait, do you know anything about Kabbalah? And he probably triumphantly, I would imagine, says, oh yeah, at least there's something I know about, Kabbalah. I've been teaching it, I've been studying, whatever, And as soon as he says that, he feels like a fool in a sense, because he's so devastated, so broken. And in his mind, they didn't say this to him, but in his mind, he's thinking that they are thinking, dude, if you know so much about Kabbalah, how come you're so devastated? Because Kabbalah is about freedom, it's about expansion, it's about truth, it's about health, it's about well-being, right? So if you know about Kabbalah, how come you're suffering? So, and this is where the tension is. You can see where the tension is, right? He says, well, I wish I could answer aloud. It is because of Kabbalah that I'm suffering. Had Frank Baler lived what he called a human life, in other words, go to school, get a job, find a woman, marry her, have some kids, 2.3 kids, a house with a picket fence, he doesn't think he would have been in this crisis. He was relentless in his pursuit for what he thought was a higher truth, and he wouldn't stop. And he kept pushing and pushing and pushing, and that led him to this crisis, which he intuitively believed would be a great thing if he could only get through, but at this time, he did not think he could get through. Well, next time we're going to pick up exactly where we left off, and that's John continuing this session with Frank Baler. If you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel so you can get the next video, and invite a friend to the classes, to the videos, because we're reading the book Frank Baler Finds T.H. A ton of teachings in this book, every paragraph. Sometimes I wonder, okay, should I stop more often and explain, or should I go a little bit faster? Because there's so much richness in every single paragraph. So you leave me a comment in the comment section if you want me to comment a little bit more often or a little bit less often. I can read straight through, or I can stop a bit more often and make more comments, because there's so much wealth of knowledge here. Appreciate you being here so much, and looking forward to the next one. Blessings.